Welcome to Face the State. I'm Ariana Bennett. Thank you for joining us. Well, roughly 80% of Nevada's land is public land, and it's often up for discussion at the state and even the national level, with regular attempts to see the land change hands. So how would that work, and how is it all affected by Nevada's history? Juan Palma from the Nature Conservancy is here now to talk about that. Juan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure, Ariana.
Now, you've spent the majority of your career working in public land management. What's that like?
Well, it was fascinating. You know, I used to manage all the Forest Service up in Lake Tahoe, and I managed all the public lands, the BLM lands in the southern part of the state of Nevada in Las Vegas, as well as all of the BLM lands in Utah. So I have a little bit of experience about what goes on with public lands, especially the BLM, but Forest Service as well.
It's a complicated thing because I think anytime you're dealing with public lands, there are a lot of public interests, right?
And rightfully so. Public lands provide so many amenities to the citizens, all the way from hunting, angling, to mining, to grazing. So rightfully so, there's a lot of discussion about public lands. And the question that people may wonder is, how did we get here? Where did this public lands come from? Well, it begins with the start of our country. As a wonderful young country, and as we were moving westward as a society, as a country, we began to acquire, purchase, or acquire some other territories, from the Louisiana Purchase to other parts of the country that began to emerge. This state of Nevada was one of those that was acquired. And so the federal government owned all of the land as they acquired it, and they began to create states. Those lands that were not yet claimed became, at that point in time, public lands.
So now we're in the situation where we have this precedent set of these are the areas that are public, these are the areas that are private, these are the areas that are state held. And it's interesting, if you look at a map, I actually think we have a map in the system now if you want to take a look at where these designations are. All that beige that you see, that's actually BLM land, and then the white is privately held. So it gives you an idea of really so much of our state is held by the federal government or controlled by the federal government, and then you see just the little blue and green parts are like other state and federal agencies. So very little of it is privately held.
Yeah, and you know, again, going back to a little bit of history, not a whole lot in the time that we have, is that when the state was created back in 1864, the state was given two sections of land. Each section is 640 acres. And so those two sections were Section 16 and Section 32, and the state was given that many acres for all kinds of purposes, schools, colleges, and there's a whole host of other laws that allow the state to get some land. And now the discussion is, should the state get more of that land? And that's a conversation that I think is left to a lot of political discussion, dialogue. It's certainly perhaps legal. For us from the Nature Conservancy, we're looking at, you know, why is this land so important for our citizens? So we want to make sure that folks get all the information to make wise choices and decisions. But certainly the state, as we move forward, you know, those lands have become valuable for all kinds of reasons, including, you know, mining, grazing, all other kinds of reasons, but including some of the recreation tourism activities that we do. And so that's why those lands are so critical today.
Now, historically, how has the balance been struck between what the federal government will control, what the state will control, and then what can be used for private use?
Well, you know, that balance has been with us for many centuries, certainly since 1864. And now the state of Nevada, you know, has some leftover lands that was given to the state back when it was created. And so some of those lands were sold by the state. They were directed to be sold. And so what is left now is that some of those lands that were not claimed by either citizens through the various acts or by the state is that they were not farmable, they were not ready for agriculture, they didn't have the water, they didn't have the climate or the soil for agriculture. So those lands remain in the hands of the public land managers. And so we have these lands that are not only BLM, Forest Service, National Park Service, but also the Department of Defense lands. And so they serve a great purpose in this country, especially the Department of Defense lands that are so critical. So those are the reasons some of these lands, you know, sometimes plays a role beyond the state. It plays a role for the whole nation, especially when it comes to some of these critical lands for Department of Defense activities.
Now, some of it is for financial reasons too, I understand, because it does cost money to manage land, even if it's empty desert. And so currently in a lot of the BLM land, that's obviously federal money that's going to be going to monitoring that land. If they were to transfer some federal land to the state, what would that process be and what would the costs be? And could the state handle that?
Well, the process would be that there would have to be some congressional action or some legal action to be able to transfer those lands to the states. Whether that's feasible or doable, that's for other people to make that decision. But in terms of the cost, I can tell you it's quite expensive to manage these public lands. I don't know the specifics for the state of Nevada, but I recently come from the state of Utah where I manage all of the Utah BLM lands. And the cost just for the BLM lands was about $100 million a year. That doesn't include the cost of wildfires. If you include the cost of wildfire, that number goes way high. Here, for an example, just last fall, we had the Little Washoe Valley fire that was quite expensive to control and to contain. So when you think of the enormous financial responsibility that the state would take, not only for the management of day-to-day activities of the public lands, but in the case of a catastrophic fire, the number would be astronomical that the citizens of the state of Utah would have to bear. And that's something that I think the citizens need to think about.
When it comes to Nevada as well. Right, makes sense. Okay, so where the conflict arises, is it typically that the wants of one body, say environmentalists who want to preserve the land, and the wants of another body who want to use the land for mining, that sort of purpose? Is it usually a conflict between those two sides?
You know, not all the time, but I think that the conflict, emerges today in 2017 in the idea that public lands were to be mined, to be grazed for timber, for all those kinds of activities. And true, that's what made our country great in the last decade. But as we moved in time, tourism recreation has become very important. For example, in some states like Utah, the recreation tourism last year was $8.19 billion. That's what that created. So sometimes the conflict is that in the old paradigm was that what good is the land if I can't use it? In today's paradigm is if you leave the land intact, it has value all to itself because we have a lot of recreation and tourism. And so that's some of the conflict that arises, is that those that would like to leave the land more intact and those that would like to use it more. I think that there's room for dialogue to be able to find that middle ground among those two bodies. I often say that it isn't the economy against the environment or the environment against the economy. It's people sitting down around the table and figuring out what makes sense for both of those interests to be addressed.
How do you think we're doing in that balance here in Nevada?
Well, I'm very hopeful. Since I've been here in Nevada for the last 8 months or 10 months that I arrived in the state back after some years being gone, is that I find that in this state there's room for common ground. I think that nature unites us, and I think that the idea that we can protect our watersheds, where our water comes from for drinking, that our clean air, that all of those things that we need as citizens, that those are the things that unite us. And so I believe here in this state we have an opportunity to have honest dialogue about our public lands and the value that they provide to each one of us. And I think if we just stop and think about, where does the water come that we drink? Where does the electricity? Where does clean energy come? It comes from public lands. And so I think that if we educate our citizens about some of these topics, that they will be able to understand the importance of public lands in our daily lives. I know for me and my children, my grandchildren, we love to recreate. We love to go to public lands, whether it's on a Saturday afternoon to a picnic or whether it's hunting. My boys and I are avid hunters, anglers. And so those public lands provide a great opportunity to our citizens, especially the urbanites, that we want to get out and enjoy these public lands.
What would you say is the biggest misconception that people have about public lands?
Well, I think that there's probably several, but I think one of those is that somehow they are owned by the federal government, and it really is us. We own them. Each one of us citizens of this country, each one of us is residents of the state of Nevada, we own them. We simply have these agencies who are managing them on our behalf. Is there room for these agencies to be more effective and efficient? Probably so. But I think that on the whole, I think they're doing the best they can given all the laws that they have to comply with. And so a misconception is somehow that we disassociate ourselves as citizens as though these lands belong to somebody else, something called the federal government, and they don't. They belong to us. And so we need to have a say on what happens on those public lands.
When it comes to land use, I think that's true. There is that misconception. I mean, if someone wanted to do something on federal lands, can they just go do it, or do they have to get a permit? I mean, how does that typically work?
It depends on what they want to do on public lands. Certainly, we can all go camping and hiking and recreating. We can do that anytime, any day. If you want to get a permit for a mine or grazing, then you have to go through a permitting process. The question becomes, can anybody go get a permit? And the answer is that multiple uses on those lands really require that we don't necessarily do everything on every acre of land. So we can't have mining and grazing and solar energy project on the same exact square foot of land. Sometimes it requires us that we do different activities on different parts of the land. And so that sometimes creates a bit of a conflict as well. We can't always do everything on every square inch of land.
How far would you say Nevada needs to go until it reaches a really good balance and a healthy, sustainable system for managing public lands?
Well, in my mind, there's very hopeful dialogue. There's potential for some counties, as we've done in the past in the state, Clark County, other counties in the state, that have struck a balance between conservation of public lands as well as for development of public lands. A lot of the lands in the Las Vegas Valley are BLM lands that are being sold at auction to the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act, and those monies go through it to education, to other purposes in the state. So that was a good balance, that people were able to sit around the table. There were some conservation of lands for wilderness, and yet there was some development in the lower valley. I think those discussions are going on in other counties around the state, and all of the parties, in my view, need to sit around the table, find that balance by careful dialogue and honest dialogue, and I think they can find that. I'm hopeful from what I've seen that will happen.
It's a good positive outlook. All right, perfect chance for us to take a quick break. Juan, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, well, coming up on Face the State, when it comes to threatened animal species in Nevada, one of the big concerns is getting an endangered listing. We'll discuss why and how some groups are working to fix the problem right after the break.